roundtable. We're really delighted to have you, and welcome to all those who are participating and following via our streaming link. We hope to involve you in our panel this evening as well. I wanted to start off by saying that there's lots of noise in South Africa at the moment. It's pretty much like being on Twitter 24/7. And the issues that appear to detain us are often the easy issues. Should the president be providing an accounting of what transpired at his game farm in respect of the burglary of who knows how many millions of rand? Absolutely yes. Should the public protector be approaching the African Commission to have it declare that Parliament's impeachment rules are unconstitutional? No. That's pretty much like her looking to approach the United States Supreme Court and asking them to make a similar ruling. Should the Guptas be extradited to stand trial here in South Africa? Yes. But to some extent, those are the easy questions. And they often drown out the harder, sometimes more important debates that we need to be having, like this one. And they're hard because the antagonists in this debate can't necessarily be characterized as acting in bad faith. They're often proceeding from the very same premise. There's alarm at the extent of poverty in this country and at the precarity of our economy. Many of you will know that in recent days, the Center for Enterprise and Development has issued a report that unequivocally says we can't afford basic income support. We at the Helen Suzman Foundation are hosting this panel tonight. And we do so not because we believe we have any conclusive answers to offer, but because we believe that this is a discussion that has to be had. And we also do so believing that while the debate, as cast in financial terms, is important, it is also one that has to be had and involve consideration of what we as South Africans owe each other. It's also important because in the public discourse at present, it's often structured in a way when discussing constitutional rights that they need only be boldly asserted. So all we have to do is say that such and such a right has been gravely violated. That type of discussion doesn't allow for an understanding of the kind of deliberative thinking, the hard work and struggle, and the expertise that is required to give life to these rights. And we're really grateful to have our panelists here tonight who, in their scholarship and their advocacy, seek to make contributions and to realize policy that will, in fact, give life to rights like access to social security and appropriate social assistance. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome our esteemed panel. To begin with, we're going to have a presentation by Lee Schaller, who is the founder of Fine Print News, and he looks to explain nuanced concepts in a digestible way. That is going to be followed by a discussion with our panelists, and from my left, we have Basetsana Meletse, who is with the Civil Society Coalition, Pay the Grants, and they've undertaken a lot of important advocacy on this issue. Next to her is Kelly Howson. She's a senior research associate at the Institute for Economic Justice, and they've obviously made considerable contributions in respect of basic income support. Next to her is Michael Sachs. He is a Wits adjunct professor and at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. He was also part of the panel, which was chaired by Alex van den Heever, who is sitting next to him, who is the chair of the Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at Wits School of Governance, and as I said, chaired the expert panel that was commissioned by the International Labour Organization and the Department of Social Development, looking at the feasibility of implementing basic income support. We're really delighted to have them. We're really delighted to have you here this evening. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lee, if that's okay.
Good evening. I just want to check, is the sound working? Good. Okay, so the basic income grant explained. First thing that struck me when I started looking into this idea of the basic income grant is the statistic. And especially a quarter of South Africans live in extreme poverty. In other words, according to Stats SA, they don't have enough money to buy enough nutrition for their nutritional needs for the month. And the idea of the basic income grant as a solution has been around for a while. I think there's even mention of it in the 2002 Taylor report and recommending its gradual implementation. But it's not really until you see the effects of COVID and the president announcing the 350 Rand grant, which sort of looks like a basic income grant in some ways, that this discussion really sort of starts to pick up. Now, the people who argue against the basic income grant will say, well, we have a really we have a big social security system already. I think something like 60% of government's expenditure is spent on the social wage. We have all of these grants. And then those who kind of argue, no, we need it, they'll point out, well, that's great, but the thing is, there's a big hole in it. There's 17 million people who are not formally employed, who earn very little, and who live in South Africa. Now, in any other country, you could go and you could get a job in the labor market, but in South Africa, obviously, that's very difficult. And also, South Africa is a highly unequal country. There's a graph kind of showing the household wealth distribution by different groups. What's really interesting to me is that sort of bottom 50%, where they have negative 2.5% wealth. That means that essentially their liabilities outstrip their assets. And if you look at the other side, the top sort of 0.1%, you have 30% wealth concentration there. And so then I sort of thought, well, has this been done anywhere else? Is there any kind of academic research into what the effects of a basic income grant would be? Have there been any case studies somewhere? And there have been several in different countries. The one that I found most interesting was the one in Namibia, because Namibia has many of the same socio-economic circumstances that we have in South Africa. They just have worse weather. And so they had the study there in the small community outside of Windhoek. And they gave people 100 Namibian dollars for a year, every month. And they observed noticeable things coming from it. Like there was a reduction in poverty, crime rates dropped, you saw people spending more money on healthcare. And there was also sort of anecdotal evidence where people started opening micro enterprises. Now, people who argue for the basic income grant, well, some of them who argue for the basic income grant say, yes, it will boost entrepreneurship, it will result in more people starting businesses and more employment. And people who argue against it, and even some of the people who argue for it will say, it's probably a step too far. It's probably more than what we could expect from a basic income grant. So then the next kind of question comes, because I think everybody, even the people who argue against the basic income grant, sort of admit that giving people money every month will help them. Kind of obvious. But where the big sort of crux of the debate lies is how much is it going to cost? Is it worth that cost? And how big it is depends on how much money you want to give people. Now, in this graph over here, you can see kind of the big dots are like more money, and at the bottom end of the scale, you have the social relief of distress grant. When it's given to everybody, it will come out at roughly 70 billion. And then on the top end of the scale, you're looking at more like closer to 500 billion. If you're giving everybody, you're not doing any means test, so you can get it, I can get it, and you give everybody 1,364 Rand. Now, this data comes from work that the IEJ has done. They commissioned it from DNA Economics. And then you go, okay, well, what does that really mean? And what it means is the government's expenditure is just over 2 trillion. So at the bottom end of the scale, you're looking at a 4% increase to fully fund the 350 Rand grant. And then at the top end of the scale, it's much bigger. It's more like 20% if you're looking at a much more generous grant. Now, Treasury has been adamant that they're not going to fund this thing with debt. They say, look, our debt service costs are going out of control. We're not going to fund it with debt. It's going to have to be taxes that we introduce. The next question is then, well, how much tax are we talking about? Now, there on the one side, you can see the different grants. Okay, that's more or less how much they would cost. Also, this is IEJ work, just to point that out. Then on the right-hand side, these are different tax proposals that they had modeling done for. Now, they've done tax proposals on many different options. These are just some of them that I sort of selected. And you can see that you need a fair amount of taxes to get to kind of like a not formally employed level where you're giving something at the food poverty line. So where the benefits of the basic income grant might be significant, you would drastically reduce poverty, there is a significant cost to it as well, which should be borne in mind. Now, if you believed in modern monetary theory, you could argue that this wouldn't be a problem, but Treasury doesn't believe in that, and it's still, and Duma's not with us tonight, so we don't have to talk about that too much. Then I think where it comes down to is you have this dynamic inside of government where on the one side of government you have the Department of Social Development that's sort of very much pushing a basic income grant and seems to be in favor of it. And large parts of civil society are in favor of it. Some parts of civil society point out that it'll actually bear downside on GDP, but where the real sort of obstruction seems to come in, or reluctance seems to come in, is from Treasury's side. And most recently, Kelly Howson, who's here with us tonight, she wrote this opinion piece in the Business Day, just pointing out that even though the grant was extended for another year, it was underfunded. It was only funded for the same amount of people that got the grants already last year. Now, with these grants, there's a gradual take-up. So not everybody who qualifies for the grant automatically goes for it. Like year one, there might be 20%, and then it sort of slowly goes up. Essentially, Treasury would have known this, but they didn't give the extra money to provide for this increase. And you would have, I think a lot of you would have seen yesterday, there was a press release brought out by Pay the Grant, by IEJ, by different Black Sash, different organizations, saying that actually the grant hasn't been paid for 2 months. That just hasn't been paid, and it's got to do with various banking agreements and things, and I'm sure they'll be able to expand on it in better detail than I would. Going back to last year, you have this case where Treasury commissioned this research from this organization called Soldru, and then they wrote a paper. It was supposed to not be a public paper, but it was leaked. And in there, they recommended this thing called the family grant, which is based on something that they have in Brazil. And works very differently. They give the money to the head of the family, and it's quite complicated. There's like severe means testing going on there. And they said, no, this will be more efficient. And they want, it basically kind of sort of say they prefer this to the basic income grant. And what you then had was research actually coming out and saying, no, it won't be more efficient. There's a lot of nuance to consider here. So you had that. You had Alex coming and giving a media interview where he comes out strongly against this idea. But what was really interesting for me in the research was to go back a whole bunch of time to a different era where the fight wasn't about basic income grant. The fight was about extending the child support grant to children who are up to 18 years old. And there you had reluctance in government to do that, eventually resulting in a court case. Now, this court case there was never a hearing because before it could kind of go to trial, you had the Polokwane conference, the ANC, and political direction changed, and they increased the grant to up to 18 years. But according to this author in this book, the department was saying very similar things to what they say now about the basic income grant. Treasury and the finance department was saying very similar things, and also suggesting an alternative approach, vocational training in this case. So it kind of says to me, well, it makes you kind of think, and I've asked Treasury about this, they haven't responded, but perhaps that there is a fundamental sort of disagreement with the grant. But it is worth contextualizing that intergovernmental policy disputes are not new or limited to the Treasury Department of Social Development dynamic. You see this in the SA sale, in the Department of Energy, and at times this is a good thing. It stops state capture from happening. Now we're talking about a policy issue. And the question is, well, who's going to win inside of government? And I don't know. But then I suppose the other question is, who should win? What should we be hoping for? And when I did my video, I was lucky enough to interview Michael Sachs, who's here tonight in Sonona. And Michael Sachs gave a really great quote saying, I think that our underlying problems are about the distribution of assets, land, spatial inequality, educational inequalities that result in highly skewed poverty. Reducing poverty and hunger is not to be sneezed at, but it's not going to address those issues. It's like really, I think, insightful balancing, almost like someone who should be, head of a government department. And then on the other side, Engana Sonona from Black Sash, he said, am I suddenly supposed to trust government now to create jobs, to have some alternative to this grant? We're on our fourth or fifth economic policy or economic paper. The argument from our side is we agree we need to create jobs, but in the meantime, let's not let people starve. That's the end of my introduction. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lee. That was just a really fabulous introduction. I am now going to turn to our panelists and ask them to provide, in a sort of limited 7-minute, 8-minute overview, a sense of their position on basic income support, the basic income grant, and to look to highlight the features of the debate and the discussion that they don't think have been fully captured or properly captured in some of the reportage around this discussion, and also issues that they feel need to be better emphasized. I'm going to start with Basetsana Maletse, and I think it's right that we start with her. As I said, she is here representing the civil society coalition Pay the Grants, but as she said to me in our discussion earlier today, she also represents a kind of grassroots community who acutely feel the impact of these types of grants. So I'll start with you, Basetsana, if that's okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Basetsana Maletse from #Pay the Grant. I don't have much to say because I'm not a researcher, I'm not anything, but I'm just a concerned resident. We are representing people from the grassroots level. My concern is one. Every time when it's the elections, we don't have a problem of ballot papers, or we don't have a problem of when is the election going to take place, but we are suffering to get an exact date. When are we going to receive our 300, a mere 350? It's been 2 months. We hear stories here next month. So I'm here. I'm not going to say much. I'm just going to ask government. Government, what are you taking us for? And can you please go revisit your policies and stop calling us the poorest of the poor because we are voters? You are there because of our voters, our votes, yet you are treating us like trash. Can you please think of that young lady who suffers when it's that time of the month? Can you imagine what is happening with that young lady? Can you think of that mother who is roaming around the street trying to find something for their kids when they are coming back from school? Can you think of that old woman who is supposed to take their medicine every morning on a hungry stomach? I'll just pause there because I think during the election, we have these ballot papers and we also have the spare ones so that if you make a mistake, you should get another one. So can we please be respected. Government, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much for what I think was a very powerful introduction to our discussion. Kelly, if I can turn to you, I'm going to ask you if you are comfortable. I've just had a request. Can you remain in your seat? And I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Is that better? Okay, do you need me to repeat what I said, or shall I carry on? Repeat, sure, repeat. Okay, I was saying I think Lee did a great job of summing up the IEJ's position for me. But as you may have gathered, our position is strongly in favour of the basic income grant. We think that it should be introduced urgently, immediately following the expiry of the SRD grant, which will be in March 2023, and that it should be pegged to one of the official national poverty lines, which are objective measures of living standards and need in South Africa. So at least the food poverty line, and rising to the level of the upper bound poverty line over time. We also argue that it should and it can be funded through various progressive taxation mechanisms that ensure that the wealthy make a net contribution and that the poorest receive a net benefit. These mechanisms, or options for such mechanisms, go beyond the simple trio of income tax, corporate tax, and value-added tax to include a plethora of options. We also strongly believe that it should be universal. Targeting has been shown over and over again to exclude upwards of 30% of eligible people and to include many who are not in the target group. It's near impossible to administer correctly, and it's counterproductive in achieving its policy aims. I understand that universality, or the idea that we should just give the grant to everybody in South Africa, takes a bit of getting one's head around. Why should we give money to rich people who don't need it? I would say that it's actually, think of it as a different distribution mechanism. One that is, in practice and in reality, much more effective in achieving its policy aims. There are several key reasons for this. And we've seen a good example in the scandal that has unfolded just this week that Batsisana referred to, where it's been revealed that the government has failed to pay a single SRD grant in the past 2 months. And that comes down to the targeting framework that has been put in place as a result of the arbitrary budget threshold that has been allocated for the grant. DSD and SASA have been forced to introduce a means testing system that has proved completely beyond the government's capability to actually implement. The social cost of this is grave, and it's difficult to quantify. There are a number of other important reasons for universality, arguments for universality, but one is social cohesion. This means a shift from framing social protection as something kind of regrettable but necessary to something that's a fundamental right of everybody living in South Africa. Everyone has a right to live with dignity. Everyone has a right to have a stake in their society and to have their basic needs met. This right should be collectively assured and guaranteed. Universal social security recognises and affirms this right, and this in turn has been shown to build social cohesion and stability, which is, I'm sure you'll agree, a project that we should be focusing on in South Africa. In terms of the question of what the debate doesn't adequately capture and what needs to be emphasised, one thing I would say is that the questions of cost and affordability, of course, are fundamental to this debate, but it's not only about numbers, it's about values. And the debate over affordability can serve to obscure and conceal this reality sometimes. A lot of people who claim that the big is not affordable present their views as objective, based in science and mathematics. But actually these are political positions. Technocratic language like this is abstracted from people's material reality. It prevents key constituencies from participating in debates that fundamentally concern them, and it gatekeeps knowledge about economics and the economy. So at its heart, the economy is about people's lives. It's not some mysterious and mystical thing that can only be understood by experts. And I would argue that those people who have been most affected by the economic crisis we find ourselves in should qualify as experts on the economy. Another thing that I think is missing from the debate around the big is that it's not only a band-aid. I think that there's a very understandable degree of resignation and disillusionment that underpins this debate on both sides. We often hear the big talked about by both proponents and opponents as a last resort, something that we have to consider now because all else has failed and the jobs are not eventuating. And I think that this does a disservice to South African politics and people. A big is not just welfareism, it's a developmental project. It's a progressive policy platform that presents real possibilities for helping us achieve better outcomes, a more inclusive economy, more resilient communities. It's absolutely not a silver bullet, but it can be part of a pioneering New Deal and a new imaginary for South Africa's future. It's a chance to start doing things differently. There's also a misconception that grants and jobs are a trade-off. We hear this narrative a lot, including from people who have a lot of power in terms of policy and resource allocation. It's this popular and enduring idea that expanding social protection will come at the expense of job growth. This is also connected to narratives that I'm sure many of us have heard. The idea that if people get handouts or money for free, it disincentivizes people from work. It encourages laziness and long-term dependency on the state. There's a conclusive body of evidence that refutes these ideas. And finally, one thing that I think is not emphasized in the debate enough, and this is my last point, is that this is a chance for South Africa to be a global pioneer in evidence-based progressive social policy. Calls for a universal basic income or a UBIG getting louder and louder around the world in both high and low income countries. And experts all over the world are increasingly identifying this as a key part of a fairer, more inclusive future. South Africa has an opportunity to show global moral leadership, the impact of which would be felt beyond South Africa's borders. We are in a position to do this precisely because we are already in an economic crisis. There are a number of people who argue that a big will induce an economic crisis, including the report from the CDE this week. And I would just encourage those people to reflect on what an economic crisis really looks like, because I think we familiar with what an economic crisis really looks like, it looks like 40%, 45% of the population without jobs, and 25% of the population living below the food poverty line. So in that context, there is little to lose and a lot to gain by considering radical structural reforms such as universal basic income. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kelly, for that contribution. I'm going to ask Michael now to make some remarks.
Hello, am I fine? I didn't actually prepare a written input of opening remarks, but I think my approach to this question, the starting point is that we have extended a 350 Rand grant to working age adults. That grant has been extended on a sustainable basis, in the sense that it's been extended for the last 3 years and the sky has not fallen, or it's agreed to extend it for 3 years and the sky has not fallen. And so spending of about 50 billion Rand, in addition to the previous fiscal kind of set of commitments that government had, is with us and is inevitable. If you ask me in abstract, if I had to think about if you were to say to me, if you had 50 to 100 billion Rand, what would you do? I'm not sure if it would be a basic income grant with that level of money. Maybe if you told me you had 1 trillion Rand, a basic income grant would be a good thing to do. But if we're talking in the ballpark of what I consider to be a reasonable addition to the fiscal framework on a kind of medium to long-term basis, I'm not sure whether the basic income grant would have been the thing. But here it is. And it's not the first time in history that a profound social crisis generates a response that might not have been the response that experts agreed on, or might not have been the response that you would have designed in an economics classroom. But history nevertheless presents us with a response. And I think we're in that kind of a position. So for me, we have to kind of take that as the starting point and ask questions of design and ask difficult questions of trade-offs that do result now that the grant is here. So, and I think fundamentally, I agree. I mean, one of the useful things about the IEJ's contribution was the acceptance of that this is about taxes. You know, you can have all kinds of macroeconomic debates about the future and how an increase in spending will lead to a macroeconomic adjustment that may or may not require you to raise taxes. That's an interesting debate to have. But if you look at the past, if you look at the societies that have introduced or increased or expanded their welfare systems, there's a very iron law, which is that higher transfers mean higher taxes as a share of GDP. So if you look at the Nordic countries, for example, extremely high taxes fund the spending. That's completely separate from the issue of kind of medium-term macroeconomic adjustment. But it means that if we're going to think about this as a long-term sustainable policy, you cannot de-link the question of taxes from the tax and the transfer are two sides of the same coin. What we are doing here, the objective of a basic income grant, is to shift opportunities for consumption, real opportunities for consumption, not money. Money is just the vehicle. But the idea is to shift opportunities from consumption from an affluent elite to people who we all agree have a level of consumption that is unacceptable to us as a society. And taxes that are not the only way of extracting real resources from one part of the population and transferring it to another. There are many other ways that it can be done. But taxes are certainly the most transparent, the most democratic, the most efficient way of doing this, which subjects it to some kind of level of democratic accountability. So in that context, and given that my understanding of the grant is that, I differ with the IEJ on this issue of universalism. Because to me, this is shifting resources from affluent South Africans who consume at a level on par with wealthy elites in Europe, and shifting those resources to the poor who consume below the level that we find acceptable. And I don't understand how that operation can be described as universal. We are shifting resources from one group of people to another. So the attempt to then call it universal strikes me as odd. It's not that odd in Sweden, because in Sweden you have full employment, and and full employment entrenched as a long-term kind of outcome of development in Sweden, for example, and other countries. And so what that enables is universalism of expenditure backed by broad-based taxation. So everybody pays taxes and everybody benefits. So everybody contributes and everybody benefits. That is not feasible in a South African context because of the poverty of the majority and the affluence of the minority is so extreme that it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that we would say it's universal. Also, I don't think it's politically feasible to have a genuinely universal grant. Anyone who has listened to Hugh Masekela's song Stimela, which is about mine workers coming from Delagoa Bay to Witbank, Emalahleni, and Johannesburg to mine coal, would disagree that we have this labor market which we live in is one that has been constructed over many years on the backs of workers in the whole sub-region. And so I don't think it's, and it's particularly worrying for me that the debate on a basic income grant is happening in parallel with an attempt to exclude non-South African citizens from low-income work. And so when you say it's universal, I mean, maybe IEJ has in mind that it will be extended to even non-South African citizens. But I don't think that's the intention within government and the ruling elite as far as I can see. So it wouldn't be, from the get-go, universal in that sense. It also doesn't strike me as being fiscally making any sense because as a technical matter, what it says is government should either forego revenue or increase expenditure in order to extend the grant to the affluent. And quite frankly, it results in more spending, but no additional impact on poverty or hunger or anything like that. So I don't really think it makes fiscal sense also. So, and then finally, maybe my last point, since Lee very kindly quoted me in his presentation, is that yes, I think the South Africa is not developing and it is not growing because it is a divided society. And those divisions are about spatial divisions. They're about land distribution. They're about the distribution of wealth. They're about the segregation of social services between a private sector which serves the minority and a public sector which serves the majority. And South Africa certainly needs to address its inequality problem and address those issues, in my view, before it can have a sustainable path of growth. But I don't see the basic income grant. There is a possibility that the basic income grant or this small transfers that we're doing actually enable South Africans to entrench the current structures of inequality that reproduce themselves, in the sense that it's possible for taxpayers or the wealthy or whatever we want to say to stay in gated communities and keep at bay the consequence of that lifestyle. And remember that, you know, going back to the history of welfare systems in the world as a liberal intervention to resolve contradictions of capitalism, they have usually been about enabling existing social relations to be maintained rather than transforming them. And that goes back to Bismarck. It was not about enabling a revolution, it was about preventing one. And so if South Africa had a path of real transformation that I could see in the horizon, or real growth and development that I could see on the horizon, then this would be a useful thing to do to help. But in the absence of that vision, if this is going to be a substitute, that suddenly this is going to solve the problem on its own, I don't think it will do. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, for what was in many ways a very provocative, I think, intervention. Alex, I'm going to turn to you, if I may.
Okay, I think there's a number of conceptual issues that I think are quite useful to understand in this kind of debate. And I think they're quite important because it depends on basically what eye you look at this problem from. I'm going to start with the first one, just on something that Michael said, which was trade-offs on policies. And I think that's something that's not often understood in the way in which social protection systems operate internationally, is that there's a distinction that you can make between what's called formal social security and informal social security. Informal social security is when there are inter-household supports for people who suffer one or other kind of shock, whether it's financial, loss of income, disability, illness, etc. And these transfers go from household to household or within a household, but the risk is basically at the level of the household itself. But the transfers still occur. And the only issue is the degree of stress that goes with those transfers. Other aspects of informal social protection include private forms of social protection, which include private insurance contracts, which are very often incomplete in terms of coherent protection. So private contracts of insurance will often exclude people, let's say in the case of healthcare, if they've got a pre-existing condition. So the very people you want to have insurance don't get it. So you have problems of who doesn't get into the private contract. And so that falls into the private or informal social security framework. When you look around the world, what's called a sort of normal level of social protection expenditure is roughly 30% of GDP. The only thing that you're looking at within that framework is the distribution between formal systems or informal systems of social protection. As I said, informal systems of social protection are more precarious. They don't offer the same degree of protection, and they often come together with extreme burdens on vulnerable households. You've also got societies in transition. So if we look at Africa, we look at South Africa. South Africa's gone through a particular kind of transition, people moving from what would be subsistence, agricultural environments, into mining activities, into urban areas. And that transition involves a very significant break in the traditional informal social protection frameworks that existed before. They get destroyed. We actually will forget that in the so-called suburbs in South Africa, we actually have very isolated households. They do rely on informal forms of social protection, medical schemes, private pension arrangements, etc. They're higher income. But they're not depending on these extended family relationships for a lot of support. But they're actually quite isolated. As you move down the income spectrum, you're having households with different levels of breakage in their informal protections. So now that's part of what one starts to look at. Within that 30%, what's happening to the people who on an invisible basis are losing their social protection? What's happening to those families, households? How is it impacting on their ability to transition from one type of environment into another? We've largely ignored that transition in South Africa, and apartheid was part of making it worse. It made that transition extremely precarious for people. Plus, our mining environment meant that people went from subsistence agriculture into a mining activity which actually destroyed lots of, it didn't bring them into the urban periphery and starting businesses and entrepreneurial activity, which you'll actually find in many other countries, but not in South Africa, much slower here because of that transition. So we've got a lot of households and families and communities that are in crisis where on an invisible basis their levels of social protection have been depleted, and it does have an impact on how they then integrate into society. When you then look at social security and social protection going forward, you have to look at it at this repairing the levels of now replacing informal with formal. That's not a trade-off. That's basically starting to substitute weak forms of social protection with stronger forms of social protection, which involve social guarantees. So now it looks like you're spending more because you're actually starting to surfaces within a formal framework. So this is part of what this discussion is. It's about a part of society that we're trying to repair, and there's an issue as to whether or not this is driven by a pre-existing crisis. And I think this is also an important question to ask. Is this a crisis? Or do you have a perpetual, permanent crisis unless you do something about it? And I would argue that what we see in South Africa today is exactly what you expect this kind of society to generate. And so it means that when you start to look at social protection systems, you're asking a question as to what's the objective when we look at income support. What is the objective of redistributive income protection that you're introducing? What are you really trying to achieve? Are we trying to resolve a crisis because of COVID? Are we trying to resolve a crisis because of apartheid? Or are what we're doing is basically making sure that there's a part of South Africa, a part of society that will not drop into income poverty? There are many forms of poverty, but this is income poverty. And so the question is, what are the consequences of having a part of your society able to drop into poverty? And what are the long-term social and economic consequences? I think South Africa is the classic case study for what would happen. I always refer to it as a sort of Republican wet dream. South Africa is what they're chasing in the United States. Well, come here and have a look at what it looks like when you get to the end point. So within the big debate, I think there's an important distinction that needs to be made between what's called basic income support and a BIG. A basic income grant is a universal unconditional allocation provided to everybody, regardless of income. So it's a particular intervention, a particular instrument. Basic income support is a framework which can include a BIG, but it includes other forms of income support. In terms of the report that was produced last year, the sort of expert panel report, the understanding that was generated there was that we don't currently have an objective for income support in South Africa. What actually are we trying to chase that has its foundation, for instance, in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in Section 27? And part of this is to say that there is actually a systemic objective that you're trying to achieve, which is that nobody should be in income poverty, ever. Now, we can't get there overnight, so there is an issue of progressively realizing that kind of objective with a combination of income support mechanisms. And what you're trying to achieve is to make sure that that you can prevent people dropping into income poverty, and or you can, when you can't prevent income poverty because of our resource constraints, that we can mitigate it. But the issue of saying, should we leave people in poverty or not, and not start, I think the argument certainly that I would have from my perspective is that this isn't about resolving a crisis, it's a systemic intervention to repair and replace historical forms of social protection with explicit forms of explicit guarantees. And explicit guarantees are consistent with, for instance, the Bill of Rights, which is saying, what should we have as a right? And just to clarify my understanding of the Bill of Rights and its point of departure, is what it's saying is everybody has a right to social security and an appropriate social assistance. But what it's not doing is saying what that is. But what it does say is South Africa must enter into a deliberative process, engage with society, and agree on what that means. And we haven't done that to date. We haven't. So this kind of process that we're engaging in now is one in which one has to look at all the evidence and facts, consult with everybody, and make what is in essence a clear framing of that right. And if you have limited resources, progressively realize the complete right as you identified. And in terms of and so progressive realization is therefore something where you've identified, certainly in my mind, an ultimate objective which you can't deliver overnight, but which you will have to deliver over time. But you've got to create a process in which, in an open democratic society, you can progress and agree on the pace and nature of that progression. And that is the conversation that essentially has to happen. So on the issue of what technocratic information comes into this, it can't be exclusive. It can't exclude people from the debate. It has to include reasonable voices in it. It must take into account subjective, normative issues as well as objective issues in a final determination. Just in terms of the kind of issues that are often raised with income support or basic income support, is that there is this issue of dependency. That you give people something for nothing and somehow they're going to become lazy, drunken. And he took the words out of my mouth. So we have large parts of our society, certainly at the sort of the top 1% of income earners, who don't actually earn their income from work. They earn their income from assets. That's where our highest income earners in South Africa are. They don't earn from labor, they earn from assets. So they don't actually have to work. So does that mean that if that argument applied, it would apply to them as well as to everybody else? The issue is that there's no evidence for dependency growing for people at the lower income end of the system. What you're largely doing is, if you're doing it progressively, improving somebody's agency to participate effectively within society. But remove them, place them under incredible stress, and they will not be able to exercise appropriate agency. They will just be in a survivalist mode. So the idea of actually providing and having as an objective the elimination of income poverty is part of taking people out of a survivalist mode and putting them into a position where they can transition and make life path decisions that are in their interests. And societies that do that change. So we've taken away that opportunity in South Africa. And I'll finish, and maybe just a last comment I'll make is on the issue of how do you finance any incremental change. And just to note that the basic income support framework that was recommended last year talked about an incremental approach. It didn't talk about leaping into a very large grant, because you can't necessarily cope with all the immediate strains that would be put on the tax system or on the economy. However, you can cope with incremental adjustments, and that's part of the deliberative process. Just on the tax issue and finance, you don't necessarily have to finance 100% of the allocation, because there is a part that will be recovered as a first order and a second order effect. But to the extent that there is a deficit in that allocation, it should be tax financed. And in all of the analyses that we've got, even if you eliminate economic growth through increasing taxes, through the negative multiplier effects, you can do it in such a way that you bring down growth to its baseline, what the growth you would have had, and you will preserve the redistributive effects, which is where you have the long-term social and economic effects, and preserve those. And maybe just a final comment is to say that I think that we don't, we're not really analyzing, and government itself hasn't fully analyzed the impact of the original SRD grant on the economy and on society. People are still remaining within government with their prejudices. And yet the issue is there's an enormous wealth of information that's now being generated on what is quite a significant experiment for South Africa, and it should be completely analyzed and understood before anybody now makes assumptions about how people behave when they receive income support. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Alex. Before we began the debate outside, Michael had said to me, how come HSF is having this panel where you don't have anyone who's obviously against the grant? That's not for lack of invitation, but I do think having a panel composed of the panelists here has actually allowed for a really kind of nuanced debate, because some of this discussion is not really so much about whether one does this, but how one does does this and the details. And I think we've had a really rich discussion and exploration of some of that. I am conscious of the time. We've got 30 minutes until we are due to come to a close, and I want to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions of the panel. I know that there have been, there's been some reference between the panel members as to the discussion, and it would be great to hear from Kelly her response to Michael, for instance. But before we do that, let's open it up to the audience and take questions here. Thanks. Sorry.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Sorry. My name is Lungile, and I work for the Morris Isaacson Center for Music. Yeah, it's such a heavy topic, and I'm so agitated. But I just want to say something with regards to the grant. I have a problem. I have an issue with the grant, and I will explain why. I work with communities in the townships, and those people are the people that actually are quite needy of the grant. But then my problem that I have with this grant is the inactivity that I see on a day-to-day basis in the townships. So the point that I'm trying to make is, to just cut straight, is that if I were to be in power, I would redirect those funds and build more recreational or skills development centers in the township, because I think that's what people need the most. People need skills, they need proper education, so that they could be more empowered than to think about the grant. So the grant is more like, it has this thing of psychologically it's building a ceiling that people can't think over and above getting that 350. And also, if as a taxpayer, I would love to see the benefits where my tax money is going. If I know that my money that I pay for a tax is being used to build schools, and then my children will benefit from that, and my grandchildren going forward will benefit from that, I think I will be happy. Other than, driving the consumption of the economy, which is what everyone is fighting for. And then lastly, I honestly feel that the grant money is also perpetuating the problem that we have in the township of inactivity. I'm not saying that people are lazy, but I'm just worried of the youth that is in the township that is dependent on this money. Where else, if we had more skills development, training centers where people could be empowered, in the next 5 years we will definitely have a different conversation. So that's my take. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I wondered if any of the panelists wanted to respond to that. I also just wanted to piggyback on that, because Michael, of course, in your intervention, you said, at the current level of the grant in terms of what is being budgeted for, so we're talking about 50 to 100 billion, you wouldn't necessarily be using that money to introduce a grant. You would possibly be looking at other interventions. And I wondered if you might want to take this opportunity to elaborate on what you would be using, if that is the money available, what type of interventions you would be looking to craft.
Okay, you want me to go?
Yep.
Not really. I don't really want to say what I would do instead, because my argument is that here we are, and we have it, and but there's no shortage of things that need funding. For instance, maybe there's a contradiction here, which is that government, and I think the way Lee presents it and the way it's often presented as some kind of interdepartmental squabble between two departments is not actually the issue, because these are about political decisions. So there's a political decision which has the support of government apparently and the ruling party, very strong, repeated over and over again, to stabilize the fiscal situation and consolidate the fiscus. There is also a political decision amongst the same people to extend basic income support and extend free higher education and reach agreements with unions on higher pay. So these two things are in contradiction. It's not about that there's an evil department called Treasury there. Maybe, I mean, I don't know how the departmental officials like integrate, but this is a political division within the ruling party that is not resolved. And I think it's much more helpful to think about it like that, because otherwise you give people power that don't really have the power to decide these things. Of course, there will always be there will be office politics that follow in the train of this political division. But the fundamental problem is that the political leadership of the country wants to have its cake and eat it, and is not prepared to make the trade-offs that are required to go down a particular path that it's advocating.
Just on the issue of skills development centers versus grants, the income support is a component of a compendium, a sort of a comprehensive system of support. It doesn't exclude or trade off against what would essentially be educational requirements, noting that not all education results in jobs. But the education is a component of agency. So is income. If you do not have income, you will struggle to do anything in life. Even if you've been well educated, if I take all your income away tomorrow and your assets and tell you survive, many people will sink. And that's in fact what social protection systems also do at the higher income levels, where people have secure jobs and incomes. It smooths their income throughout life. So the issue is income is an absolutely critical. It's like choosing between whether or not you eat or drink or breathe. This is one of those components. So the trade-off can't be extreme. You can't have no oxygen because we've only got to eat. So then in terms of the issue of government's finances, government does need to look at its finances, and it does need to look at its priorities. The question is, how does the process of prioritization occur? It's not just a technical question, it's also a deliberative one. It involves a social contract, an engagement with society. We haven't necessarily had this in a very coherent way, certainly not recently, and in the past. And so the question is, what are our social priorities? The difference between a very rich person spending 350 Rand and somebody without adequate income spending 300 Rand is quite different in terms of the impact it has on those individuals. Using economic terms, it's the utility of that 350 Rand is much higher in the hands of a very low-income person than it is in somebody who's incredibly rich, who they don't even notice it. So the point is that, in fact, for something that a large number of people don't really notice, you give it to a lot of people who do notice, and it has an impact on their choices. So I think that's the kind of choice. Government can make any set of priorities financially and fiscally affordable, but government shouldn't end up in a position where it has squandered its resources. And I'll make one comment on the sort of the evil treasury remark. There was a point in time where South Africa went through a significant growth phase. And the argument that is always made is that, well, we have to have fiscal resources in order to do A, B, C, or D. So if we look at the period around about 2002, 2003, and you go and check the number of tax breaks that were introduced during that period, the fact that we fully advance funded the GEPF during this period, all of those things actually created an artificial constraint on government's resources. And that was, I would argue, I mean, that's my sense of internal discussions within government, that was done in order to restrict the funds potentially available for social allocations. So when people make the argument, fiscal consolidation, they're often trying to create a permanent situation where there is a fiscal consolidation argument. And that's why it is important that technical engagement occurs on our fiscal resources, so that in fact these aren't fudged in the debate and just used as spurious arguments to not allocate on the basis of ideological ground.
I would like to say you can have all the skills, but we cannot shy away that here in South Africa you have to have a connection. You can have all the skills and everything, but if you don't have connection, you will just remain with those skills and nowhere else to go.
I think my mic still works, yeah. Just on the question of grants enabling dependency, this is a very kind of widely held concern and anxiety, and I can understand the anxiety. We've heard it expressed by people in all levels of government as well, that grants are not an investment in people's futures. They're just an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And I can understand why that's intuitive as well. There's a lot of research actually that shows that when people are asked themselves, what would you do if you were given a sum of money every month? Would you quit your job and, drink? and people say, no, I wouldn't do that. I would use it to invest in this venture, or this idea, or use it to help my family, my community. But when people are asked, what do you think other people will do if they're given a sum of money every month? Often the answer is, they'll be lazy. And it's an assumption about human nature that is quite a cynical assumption. There's a growing body of evidence from the field of industrial psychology, for instance, that shows people have a lot of motivations to work that go beyond basic survival, meeting their basic needs. Those motivations include contributing to their communities, a sense of self-satisfaction in building skills, self-esteem that is derived from meaningful work. And this is very well supported in the research. And this research also shows that, as Alex said, when people have agency and autonomy, they're more likely to pursue these intrinsic motivations to engage in economic activities that they find personally meaningful. So the question is not about enabling people to exist and survive. And I think that a grant of $350, while it has made an important contribution to people's survival, is limited in terms of the agency that it could provide. It's just over half of the food poverty line. But a grant of slightly more that allows people to meet their basic needs then allows them the autonomy, the insurance effect to take on economic risks, to take on job search. And just to quickly finish, there was some very interesting research that came out of a survey in South Africa that was undertaken in 2019, so before the pandemic, which showed that the average cost of searching for a job for young people in South Africa is 938 Rand a month. So that really puts the 350 grant in perspective, But despite that, there's research, a rapid assessment that was done for the Department of Social Development on the usage of the 350 grant, which showed that people spent it first and foremost on food, but then they also spent it on transport, data, the kind of things that you need to participate in the economy, the kind of things that you need to get a job. And there was another report by an organization, I believe called Youth Capital, which showed that a lot of young people living in poverty, nevertheless spent their social grants on searching for a job. So I think that I can understand the reflex that we have to say a grant doesn't fix the problem of education, it doesn't fix the problem of skills, it doesn't fix the problem of jobs, but I agree with Alex that it creates the enabling environment for those problems to begin to be addressed.
So I would have gone further than Lee's introduction. I would have wanted to put up that stat on the breakdown of the South African economy, which we've seen again this week, showing that easily the biggest sector is the financial sector, followed by services. Government is relatively small. And I would put that together with the, I guess, fairly obvious fact that in almost every sector that we see, we effectively have a monopoly. And I would map that to the income distribution that you showed. And in the face of an incompetent public service that is unable to deliver the basics, the reason that we have such a need with vast unemployment and no jobs despite the skills that we've talked about is because we don't make anything, and because that rich class who dominates those monopolies make darn sure that we don't allow innovation. Innovation doesn't happen at the bottom end of the pyramid in South Africa because it is much easier to make a lot of money focusing on the top 15%. And if anybody is successfully starting to do interesting work in the middle income and even lower income, they're rapidly shut down. That's the nature of so the reason that you tax people is not really about just about, I'm sorry Duma wasn't here, I'm sure he could put this far more articulately than I am. I'm a physician, not an economist, but I do understand the diagnosis. We have a situation of power imbalances, and it's not, unless we address that, unless we use taxes to restrain those power, unless we aggressively break up those monopolies, unless we protect the economy and actually make local things that require, people working in factories in the fields, we have the ridiculous situation of massive unmet need and mothballed factories and fallow land. That's the problem. So for me, the technical debate and the moral debate is obvious. The technical debate is not helpful. We have an economy that is structured so bizarrely that it leaves us in the situation. Michael's argument that actually we need a revolution, but since we can't have a revolution, let's be as conservative as we possibly can. How do we actually create an economy that actually matches demand and supply? You don't have to be an economist to understand that, and we're not doing that at all.
Thank you very much, Mike Brown. The previous gentleman, I think, started off right when he said that the biggest sector we've got in South Africa is the financial sector. And when we're talking about a basic income grant, and I think that's critical in South Africa, I think the state where we're at the moment, we do need to support the poorest of the poor, and that means a grant in some form, whether it's a BIG or something structured in the social system or income support, but we need that. Now, the biggest issue from the other questions we've had is how do we distribute it? How do I get hold of this? Now, we've got this massive financial sector in South Africa, which dominates the economy, and that distributes just as many income grants to people as this type of BIG does, because it distributes interest, it distributes dividends, it distributes annuities, it distributes pensions, it distributes money transfers. You can transfer money between South Africa and the darkest remote parts of Malawi and Rwanda on your mobile phone, yet you can't pay an income grant. So what we're talking about is just distributing finance. And distributing finance is not difficult. The systems are there. The lady said, I'm not connected. If you're not connected in South Africa, you can't get anything, but you've got a mobile phone. You visit a supermarket. You can access a terminal in a supermarket that gives you your grant. So what we've got to use in South Africa is the systems that are already there, that are distributing. And distributing finance is quite simple. We just need to have a change in thinking in government. That's not really a question, sorry, that's a statement, but there might be a question out of that. Thank you.
Very much. We are sort of rapidly running to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to the questions and statements as they wish, and also to make any concluding remarks. And we'll start with you, Basetsana, if you are happy to do that.
My final remark will be, to some of us, 350 is a salary, not even a stipend. Thank you.
I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and in a lot of ways I'm an outsider or a newcomer to this discussion. I didn't grow up in South Africa. I've done a lot of research here and worked here for a while, and I think that perhaps gives me a bit of an outsider's perspective. But perhaps a bit of a naive perspective in some ways, in the sense that I like to focus on the possibilities, the kind of utopian imaginary, and I completely appreciate that there is a long way to go to reach any kind of utopian imaginary. But I wanted to respond briefly to the question about universalism and universality. I am completely in agreement that a basic income grant, a universal basic income grant, should be fundamentally redistributive. It should redistribute wealth from the people in this society who are enormously wealthy to the people who are in need. I think that where we perhaps differ is that I think that universality is a more efficient way of doing that, a more effective way of doing that than targeting. Targeting on paper sounds like it makes sense. We should target the people who are in need. In reality, what we've seen is that targeting is incredibly difficult to administer. And I think that it's, as the gentleman said, distribution should be easy, but it is not. We've seen this with the SRD grant. There was the need to introduce means testing to cap the recipients at 10.5 million people. That required the verification capabilities of the banks. Suddenly we need agreement from the banks to verify every single applicant's eligibility against this means tested threshold. What has been the result? Nobody has received their grant for 2 months. Universality, on the other hand, if it is well designed, if it is well implemented, completely eliminates this issue of exclusion errors and inclusion errors, the injustice of exclusion. But there can be effective clawback mechanisms on the wealthiest to ensure that the wealthiest make a net contribution while the poorest have a net gain. So universality is much easier to administer, and it also underpins the kind of social compact that is desperately needed in South Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the thing is, and I think when we were in the panel with Alex, we discussed this at length. and it almost became a moral question, because you can pose it like this. Oh, sorry. This question of universality almost became a moral question, because in a sense, and I mean, I know people don't like thinking like this, but this is how, at least from one angle, you have to think about it. For a fixed sum of allocation, let's say it's 100 billion, do you have a higher grant value and target it to those most in need? Or do you have a lower grant value and say everybody can get it? That's a kind of policy trade-off you have to somehow engage with. And while, you know, to me the kind of moral aspiration for a common society in which things are universal, I sympathize with. But as a matter of practical policy, and I suppose, you know, when I was in Treasury, the big issue then was the universalization of the old age grant. And there, in a situation of fiscal constraint, you're saying you want 5 or 6 billion rand to extend something to people who are not in need, because that would be and to me that trade-off doesn't seem worth making. So while we might aspire to universalism in the long run, I think we have to really the size of the grant and the targeting at those who are most in need, I think are the important things. And I think that doesn't mean that the issues of administrative cost or stigmatizing people or are non-issues. Those are important issues, but I think kind of we have the technology that can enable us to address those administrative issues now, which maybe wasn't there in the past. If I look at the old age grant and the child support grant, there's not a massive problem of lack of access to those grants because there's a means test. The really striking thing about the regulations that were issued by the DSD, Department of Social Development, that it didn't make any sense to me, was that they put the income threshold at 350 Rand. And at first I thought they're making a mistake. It can't possibly be right. The 350 Rand is the value of the grant. But they're saying you have to earn less than 350 Rand in order to qualify, which if you think about it is 10 Rand a day or 11 Rand a day. And it's like, how do you prove that somebody earns 10 or 11 Rand a day? Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. But on the other extreme, kind of the clawback and saying, you know, we're going to give people the money and then we're going to take away more. To me, yeah, you can call that universal, but I don't think it really, for me, it's not really universal. So I think we're going down this path. There are a lot of difficult issues. Fundamentally, if South Africa doesn't have a path, we can't just break stuff. That's not a path of development, breaking monopolies. We may need to break monopolies on a path of development to achieve something. But if we don't know what it is we're trying to achieve, just breaking monopolies is not going to help us. That's how I would respond to Brian. And I think that's fundamentally where we are. We don't have a program of transformation, of change, and of growth and development in this society. And in those conditions, a basic income grant has become necessary. But I struggle to see it. I think we need to carve out that path of development somehow.
Just on the issue of universality, on certain terms, targeting. In fact, a universal allocation is actually the targeted one because you target through a tax clawback. The means test is not it's targeting, but it's actually you're determining the target through eligibility criteria. So you're eligible because you comply with the means test or you comply with an income test. So the issue is you're targeting no matter what. The question is what's the most efficient method? What's interesting about what happened with the COVID SRD grant, I mean, it's worth noting that the grant was allocated to a substantial number of people very quickly because government decided to break its normal way of doing things, which is a good thing. The application process, they created a digital platform. People actually found a way to get people to enroll through smartphones. The eligibility test was basically you applied and they had a check against banks, against SARS, against other environments to check whether somebody had some level of income. And if they had zero income and that sort of validated, they were allowed in, no questions asked. If somebody was blocked because some income showed, but it could have been, you know, a donation or something, then somebody might go through a check. Now, the Department of Social Development effectively only has the capability to administer strictly about 1 million applicants a year on a means test. And it's already doing that for the current grant system. So to suddenly put in place an administrative system for applying a means test without doing what they were doing before results in what we're seeing now. And this is kind of what's happened, is that government basically started doing the stuff that it was doing before. It's not Department of Social Development doing this. There was a constraint placed on what they would do, and it's resulted in this blockage, and it does need to be dealt with. Then there's another way of looking at partial universalism. In many respects, this was a discussion I certainly had after the Lunt Commission, and people were talking about the implementation of the child support grant first, which was only like 100 Rand and only from 0 to 6. Question is, what should the means test be? And when you do the analyses, there's going to be a huge grey area of people whose incomes are really indeterminate. And there's a self-selection process that occurs for these grants. I mean, the only people who are going to logically apply for a 350 Rand grant are people who feel there's value in that 350 Rand grant. I'm not going to apply for it. And so that self-selection process is in itself an eligibility test. And that's what the innovation was that the Department of Social Development was able to exploit in 2020. As they got all those people combined with the digital platform, they got basically a self-selection process to occur. And there is some corruption, you know, some civil servants and people with incomes who took advantage of the system, but a paltry few by comparison to the total value of the grant. So this is part of the issue that we have to look at. What are innovative ways of making sure that we can ramp up an income support program more rapidly than the tried and tested old approach? And I think that it's a pity that we've gone backwards with this. Just in terms of the issue of financial sector, I think that the overall problem with how our economy has developed, I think, is a real one, but it becomes a much deeper debate. But there is an issue when you start to look at subsidies into the financial services sector. So the tax expenditure subsidies going into the retirement system are probably around about 120 billion Rand a year. That's quite a lot of money. That's more than moving toward 3 times the value of the current COVID SRD grant. And that's going to the highest income people in South Africa. But in reality, it's not really going to them. It's actually creating an incentive for people to participate in certain products within the financial services sector. And there has never been a value for money assessment of the subsidy, never. It was never assessed when these subsidies were created, and it's not been assessed to date. They never re-evaluated. So this is also an issue that's in this, because when one does look at the universalization, let's say, of the state old age pension, the original motivation for having a subsidy for retirement provision was to prevent people from becoming dependent on the state old age grant, so they're saving money. But what you're actually doing is spending about 120 billion Rand a year to prevent 12 billion Rand a year's worth of expenditure. Makes absolutely no sense, but that was what was stated in the budget review as the rationale for this tax subsidy. And again, it points to the irrationality in government decision making when it goes unquestioned. So when you do look at universalizing an old age grant, it doesn't have to be in the conventional way of a grant, but it does mean you start to look at, well, we're already giving all of these subsidies, what's a more efficient and effective way of creating a baseline tier 1 protection mechanism for everybody? How do we eliminate the need for the application of means tests if we can avoid it? But I'm just pointing out that that's I think, that's why there's so much to debate and deliberate around these issues. And what we have done up until now, and I'll just finish with this, is that we actually haven't deliberated. And we also haven't had a policy discussion that goes from discussions of social protection one area, like private contributory retirement provision, to non-contributory forms of social protection. They are part of a discussion on harmonizing social protection. And in fact, that's where universalization ultimately comes in. Universal social protection isn't always universal access to a single support mechanism. It's very often ensuring that there's a coherent support mechanism from non-contributory to contributory, that social insurance and in many cases mandatory private insurance that is properly regulated, that provides everybody with coherent protection all the way through, and it becomes formal social protection when it becomes incorporated into a social guarantee which is embedded in legislation. And that's what we don't have at this point.
Thanks. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to all our panelists for what I think has been a really rich and illuminating discussion, and I hope sort of helps take us towards a kind of deliberative engagement in these issues. I wanted to say thank you to the audience for joining us this evening and for participating. And lastly, can I just thank the FNF for their support this evening, and to the HSF team, to Anton, to Jos, to Chelsea, to Basil, but especially to the researchers, Wiseman, Sophie and Chris, who have really been the engine drivers of this and put this together. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you. Good night.